So welcome everyone. We have 24 attendees so far. Hopefully some others will come in. Welcome to our presentation tonight of the Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice project of the Alliance of Baptists, professors of sociology of religion and race, and done in partnership with the Lilly Endowment. So as we gather, folks are already writing their name and their church's name and location in the chat. Please do that as a way of greeting others who are joining us. We are sharing our preliminary findings tonight from the first year of our 5-year project designed to actively confront structures of racism in order to remove a crucial obstacle to congregational thriving. We believe that churches will thrive only as we commit to the thriving of all, especially communities of color. So among those sharing findings from the first year of the project tonight will be Gerardo Marti. He is the Keenan Professor of Sociology at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. He is the architect of the Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice project, and he worships at Congregational Partner Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte. Kevin Daughtry will be reporting on preliminary findings and the data tonight. He is Associate Professor of Sociology at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where he is an award-winning teacher and researcher. And he's got published research papers in leading academic journals. And joining them is their colleague and our friend Mark Mulder, who serves as professor of sociology at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who focuses his work and his writings on urban congregations and their changing racial and ethnic demographics. And my name is Paula Clayton Dempsey, and it's my pleasure to work alongside them and you as the Alliance of Baptists Thrive Project Coordinator. And also to open our meeting, I wanted to share with you a reading from the book named Embers, One Ojibwe's Meditations as a way of getting us started. This is written by Richard Wagamese. How to make a dream come true. Don't focus on the dream, or it will always remain a dream. Instead, focus on the first action you can take to bring that dream a little closer. Then take it. Now focus on the next action and take that. Each step brings the dream closer to becoming a reality. Why? Well, our elders teach that the dream world and the real world operate on the same energy. You link them through the power of choice. Choose action, and the dream moves even closer to the real. So we've been acting for a year, and we're going to report on those actions for this year that we have been trying to make our dream become real. And I'm very glad to have my colleagues to present what we've learned so far. Gerardo?
Well, good evening, everyone. Wherever you are, welcome. We have been so glad to be a part of this journey together. This is a project that is a pioneering project. No one really knows how to address the profound issues of whiteness and racial exclusion that remains in American Christianity. And yet we are making an effort. And in doing so, we have found a wonderful partner in all of you. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know so many of you and very much appreciate that you have allowed us into your churches and into your stories to allow us to hear more about your own experiences. Sometimes it's your challenges, sometimes it's your frustrations, but often your inspirations. And we just want to take a moment to say that we really appreciate the time that so many of you and so many people in your churches have spent with us. We just simply would not be able to understand and try to get to the kinds of things we really want to address it if we didn't have the opportunity for people to just share themselves. So thank you for that. Today is the beginning of our being able to talk on the basis of things that we are coming to know more confidently about what's happening in your churches. Before, it was speculation and anecdote, and it didn't matter really who we talked to in the Alliance. Everyone only had a limited perspective based on the visits that they've had, the people that they know, the particular churches they've been in. And we have done our best. The survey itself you're going to hear about is an expansive one and drew from so many people that we were able to get insights on the entirety of the Alliance network. And in terms of our interviews, it is through the graciousness of people who signed up and committed to being part of the Thrive cohort that we were able to meet with several people in every Thrive church in the United States, so that we were able to get a better handle on things from the standpoint of people's experiences, the things that they could share from their own observations and the lives that they've lived and the ministries that they've participated in. And with that, we have a much better understanding of things than we had certainly at the beginning of the project. And it has given us a privileged look, really in the first time of the history of the Alliance. So what you're hearing today has not happened in the history of the Alliance at all, and gives us a starting point for being able to think through not only where we are now, but where the Alliance could be in the near future. It is a 5-year project, and that means that we begin with listening. We begin with trying to understand what's going on and to get a better handle so that we can mirror back what is actually happening in the churches. Our next step will be to then take our understanding and to be more strategic, entering into dialogue about what can we do in our ministries, given what we know, to begin to either revise or put into new practices or stop practices that really should be stopping, as we think more strategically and with theological sensitivity about where our ministry should be going. And then the next step after that will be to do another reflection towards the end of our 5 years that will say, where have we come from? What have we learned? How have we changed? So this is very much the beginning, but it is not the end. And we hope that we will be able to see and partner with each other for a long time, because you are a part of this project. Your interaction, your thoughts, your ability to think through and work through things with us is very much what this is about. So today we bring to you 2 particular forms of data. One will be the survey, and Kevin will lead us with that. And the next are some themes that we found out of the interviews. I'll talk a little bit about that, and Mark will also then talk a little bit about that. Then after that, we can open up for questions, which you can enter into the chat, and we can do the best we can to reflect back to you things either that need to be clarified or additional curiosities that you may have. We only have a limited time, so we did not choose to present everything that we've learned, and we don't have all the data put on slides for you today. But we have learned a lot. And so that means that if later on you go, well, I'm still curious about this, you're very welcome to put that in the chat, as I'm sure that between the 3 of us, we'll be able to talk through that and give you a little bit of background on that. So with that, let me move on to Kevin Doherty, and Kevin can go ahead and share with us our survey results.
Yeah, thanks,
Kevin?
Gerardo. So I'm Kevin Doherty, and friends, I just want to echo what you've already heard from Paul and Gerardo. A project like this would never be able to occur if it wasn't for your graciousness to us to share your lives, your ideas, your thoughts of your church in candid ways. And so, I want to, before I present any of the survey findings, just echo again what you've heard and say thank you for making this project possible. And we're excited to learn from you and with you, and hopefully do some meaningful things together as we move forward. So I am going to present what we have learned from our survey. And I want to say thank you to all of you who participated in this survey. It occurred from October to November in 2021. And we had a total of over 1,000 people, 1,157 people complete the survey. And so first I'm going to start with just some characteristics of who participated. This gives us a snapshot into the Alliance. And then I'm going to pull out some specific themes regarding the core issues of the project that we're interested in, issues of working for racial justice, perceptions of racial inequality in society, the actions that you as individuals and the actions that your churches are taking. So these 1,157 respondents represent 25% of the entire Alliance database. Now, I don't know how many of you are up on the details of survey research, but actually a 25% response rate is pretty outstanding for survey research. And we have pretty good confidence that the 25% of you that did participate is a fairly good, not a perfect, but a fairly good depiction of the Alliance overall. Now, why we know this? Well, 62% of you identify as female, 89% identify as white, non-Hispanic. And these percentages actually match very closely national survey data on other mainline Protestant denominations. So if the Alliance is typical of other mainline Protestant denominations, these percentages by gender and race fall very closely in line with those. So that gives us some confidence in our data. Second, let's take a look at the age and the length of time in the church of these survey respondents. Well, there's a range of ages. The youngest person that participated was 18. The oldest was 96. God bless that senior saint for taking the survey. The average age was 62, and you can see that over half fell in that category of 60 to 80 years old. Again, also very common of mainline Protestant churches in the United States, an aging demographic in those congregations. Time in the church, well, that ranged from under a year to 85 years, a lifetime member. Been there my entire life. God bless you. And so, but a good range here. Look, a third of the respondents that had been in their place of worship in their Alliance church for less than 10 years. Whereas over a quarter that had been there 30 to 85 years. And I should say that our 1,157 respondents came from 176 different congregations across the United States. So a broad cross-section of Alliance congregations and Alliance members in non-Alliance congregations, which is true of the larger Alliance network. Of perhaps more interest is what do Alliance members say about their motivation to be engaged in work towards racial justice? Well, one of the survey items was, are you motivated or unmotivated to work toward racial justice in our country? And in general, Alliance members are motivated. In fact, a third very motivated. 85% agreed that they were motivated or very motivated to work towards racial justice. 97% in another survey item say that whites are advantaged over people of color in our country today. And Alliance members see structural reasons for this inequality. The things that were specified on the survey were limited educational opportunities for people of color, hiring discrimination, and a history of past discrimination. So, motivated to work to justice, clearly see racial inequalities, attribute those racial inequalities to structural reasons. Also, the survey told us that you're motivated by your faith to do this work of racial justice. 87% of the respondents to the survey said that the Bible teaches to stand up for the oppressed. And 84% said that the Bible teaches not to take advantage of immigrants. So we're getting this very clear picture that really matches the covenant of the Alliance, that this is what we're about as a people of faith. These are the things that we're committed to. Well, next we're going to move to talk about what you are actually doing individually to take action on the Bible's teaching to stand up for the oppressed. And here we're going to start to see some differences between what we say we believe and the actions that we're actually taking. So here are the top reasons, the top 5 reasons. The survey item that we asked was, I currently act on the Bible's teaching to stand up for the oppressed by doing the following. And there was a list of options. Well, these were the top options selected by Alliance members to the survey. First was expressing support for racial justice with friends and neighbors. 93% of Alliance members are doing this, the respondents to the survey. Second, praying for racial justice. 85% of respondents say that they're doing this. Third, repenting for the oppression in our society. 64% of respondents say this. Now, I want to pause here for a moment before I show you the last two to note that all three of these are relatively individualistic responses in the work of racial justice. Talking to friends and family, those closest to us, praying, even repenting. I can personally repent for the sins of my country. Now, these next two, while still in the top 5, you'll notice that barely a half of Alliance respondents mention these, and they are working to end disadvantages in the criminal justice system and working to end discriminatory hiring practices. So what we see here is this interesting, thinking about the slide that we saw just before this. Alliance members see racism as having structural causes, but their anti-racism work tends to be individualistic, speaking, praying, repenting. And we heard the same themes in our interviews. Respondents told us that addressing racism happens through relationships, listening, awareness, self-examination. All of these important, but largely individualistic. Moving from individual characteristics, we asked questions, as you might remember from the survey, about your church and your perceptions of the church. And what we heard was, in general, Alliance members feel that their church has a healthy racial climate. Overall, the racial climate in my church is healthy was the survey item, and 80% of respondents agreed. Only 1 in 10 disagreed with this statement. So the perception is that your churches are doing a pretty good job in terms of promoting healthy racial interactions. Well, when we start to dig a little bit deeper, we see that the participation and, in fact, perceptions of church differ in some significant ways by race. So what I'm going to show you next is a comparison between levels of participation and perceptions of the church for whites and persons of color in the Alliance. Now, you might remember 89% of our respondents were white, and all of the other non-white racial and ethnic groups together constituted 11%. I regret that we don't have enough African Americans or Latinos or Asians to be able to separate out each group. So what we're left to do is to make these broad comparisons between white Alliance members and persons of color. But even with those broad comparisons, we see some really interesting patterns. So let's look first at the levels of participation. Well, the good news is that survey respondents overall were active in their churches, but some more than others. So first, let me show you the white respondents to participation in church. And the question was approximately how often do you participate in any type of activity at your church? 85% of our white respondents were involved with their church once a week or more. Well, our respondents of color, also high levels of participation, but notice not as high as our white respondents. 85% of white respondents in their place of worship once a week or more, 75% of Alliance members of color. So although we see high rates of participation for all Alliance members, whites participate more frequently than people of color in these Alliance churches. And this is actually true of other congregations as well. Rates of belonging and participation are higher across the United States among the largest racial group in a congregation, whatever that racial group is. So if it's a Black church, African American Black members participate more than the few white or Latino members that are in that church. And the same is true here with the Alliance for white members. But it's not just participation. Next, I want to show you that perceptions of the church actually differ across these two groups as well. So here I'm going to present two items, one of which you've already seen. It's that healthy racial climate. Overall, the racial climate at my church is healthy, was the statement. And guess who perceives their church as having a healthier racial climate? It's white alliance members, 3/4, as compared to about 2/3 of non-white. Well, the other a parallel question was that, is there racial tension at your church? And the statement was, there is racial tension at my church. Guess who perceives racial tension? Alliance members of color, far more likely than whites. Now, you might look at these percentages and say, wow, 73% to 65%, that barely seems, consequential. Well, although the percentage differences aren't huge, they are statistically significant. And what that means is this is not chance. That what we're picking up here, while not a massive difference between the two groups, does reflect a pattern that is different for Blacks, for people of color, and for whites in alliance churches. And it's a real difference. It's not some chance artifact of the statistics. And you're going to hear more about this that will come out from our interviews. But we actually had a set of additional survey items that also speak more to this. So we asked on the survey, what aspects of your churches favor different racial or ethnic groups, including what aspects of your church favor whites, the statistically largest racial group in the alliance. And this is what respondents, regardless of race, told us. That 14% said mission and vision favors whites, about a quarter said hiring. So neither mission or vision nor hiring seem to be major explanations of how people might feel disadvantaged in their church. But look at teaching and preaching and worship. So nearly half of respondents, and remember, this is respondents regardless of race, white, Black, Asian, Latino, multiracial, other racial groups, half say that teaching and preaching style favor whites, and over half, 56%, say that the worship music favors whites. 2/3 of respondents believe that whites experience social advantages in their congregations. And people of color are more likely than white members to feel pressure to give up parts of their cultural identity to fit the church, in particular 3 ways: worship music, forming friendships, and theology. On those 3 items, persons of color in the alliance were twice or even 3 times more likely to say they have to give up their part of their cultural identity to fit into the church in those 3 ways, in regard to the music, forming friendships, and theology. Well, another question that we asked were, what are the barriers that alliance members face to participating in fostering healthy racial dynamics at their church? And here again, we see a difference between white alliance members and alliance members of color. The persons of color in alliance churches are significantly more likely than whites to say, I do not think my efforts will make a difference. So we see from the survey this repeated pattern of whites and persons of color participating in churches at a different level and perceiving different things about their churches. And then we're going to hear more about this in the interviews that you'll hear from Mark and Gerardo.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I especially appreciate your note on talking about statistical significance, because by looking at bar graphs like this, as many people see in the news or in other kinds of trends, these differences do not look like much when you just try to count the difference in percentage points, like subtracting between them. But behind these numbers is a more sophisticated analysis that you've been able to do that would indicate that these patterns are persistent, and that means that we need to pay attention to those differences as significant differences, enduring differences. I think that's very helpful. And again, I appreciate you pointing that out. As you all know, we pursued interviews in order to try to get at, what were people thinking? The questions were intended to be fairly open and to allow people to describe whatever they wanted. And our interviews were very rich. Out of that, we've selected 5 themes from the interviews that we thought were most significant and maybe indeed most interesting for us in being able to think together. So the first is when we talked about people or talked about your churches and just asked you to try to give us a sense of your churches, um, everyone affirmed, it seemed, that the churches were progressive churches. So the churches affirmed their progressiveness, and they said things like our church is very progressive, or it has a long history of being welcoming and affirming, or that it's social justice minded, or that one person said, "We're the church that wants to do the right thing." Many members were attracted to the church due to the social justice stances that they had. So definitely a central aspect of the identity of Alliance churches is their progressiveness. Now, there might be some tension that occurs in some churches. One pastor talked about the tension between progressive Protestant liberalism and white conservative evangelicalism in their congregation. That was noted. Some also said that, yeah, they kind of like the social justice thing, but they're just happy to write a check, but not necessarily willing to get their hands dirty. So even the progressiveness had its own flavor to it in different things. But that sense of affirmation about the stance and values of the church was very strong. Associated with that also was that the churches were very white. And so churches affirmed their progressiveness, but they also quickly affirmed the whiteness of their church. I remember one woman said, there is an aura of whiteness in the church. And another woman said, there's an inherent incompleteness to addressing whiteness in our congregation. So that sense of having an identity that is not only progressive, theologically, social justice minded, but also that there is a racial profile that is a part of the church as well. Now, in terms of trying to talk about progressiveness, another theme that emerged was that the progressiveness, particularly on race, is not uniform. One of the leaders, a lay leader from the church, was one among many who shared that not everyone is, quote unquote, on board when it comes to racial justice, or that there are people who pay lip service, or that many people talked about hearing people say that they were tired of hearing about race, or that they felt that it was time for the church to move on from talking about race. That some people around them are saying things like, I have nothing to do with this. There's even some people who are reacting to the emphasis on racial justice on a Sunday morning service because they believe that Sunday morning is not a time to be talking about social justice. The quote was that Sunday is a day of rest. It's meant to be peaceful instead of social justice. So instead of social justice, we're supposed to just talk about God. So that feeling of discomfort of dealing with issues of racism, racial exclusion, intrudes on some people's perception of what Sunday morning worship is supposed to be all about. The other thing in relation to being progressive and race not being uniform is also that the anti-racism emphasis is new. People said that the focus on racial justice is new, that in the past, their church had spent a lot of time on LGBTQ plus issues and moving people along, and now racial justice is the new emphasis, is where we're at now. People talked about book clubs, seminars, and even just talking about it. It's having an effect because there are many people who talked about the kinds of shifts and changes that they are making. I remember a very highly educated white man who talked about shifting his mind about race-based discrimination. There was another person involved in the music of their churches who said, I'd grown tremendously. Another woman said, I'm sure there are systems that oppress people of color, and I'm only beginning to understand the mechanisms. I talked with a few people who, when talking about this kind of thing and the anti-racist efforts of their church, just said, I just didn't know. Now, what's very intriguing for me as a sociologist is that you usually don't hear people who are older, mature adults, talking about the way in which they've changed on things that are so substantive and really transforming as really learning about racial justice and their place in it. And yet it was something that we heard a lot of I remember one woman who was in her 70s, and she just resonated with so many others who said that the church's focus on race goes in fits and starts, and that she wasn't sure if the church had yet found their focus, but that she had gained so much from it, and that it had given her a substantive direction for her growth in her own spirituality and being a person. Of course, many people talked about pushback from the emphasis on racism, that there's opposition, that there's tension, that those conflicts can be about physical changes that are happening in the building, could be a battle of the banners or of the flags. It could be other shifts that have happened in the liturgy of the congregation. So it's definitely not been a smooth ride for everyone in working through these issues. So it's new, but also at times a point of tension and conflict. Now, another thing that I thought was so important about the themes that we emerged was about thinking about the role of people of color in these white dominant churches who are now beginning to emphasize issues of racial justice. And one of the things that stood out was that Black clergy and Black members are a distinct minority in the churches. And why I say a distinct minority is because they feel themselves to be a minority in their churches. I spoke to more than one African American who said, when I sit down, I count how many people of color are in the church. And they would say that it would usually be like about 3, including themselves. And so that sense of having a small number, but also knowing where you are and where other people of color are, is something that really stood out to me because they're not having the same experience that a lot of other people are having when they go to a church or when they go to a gathering, or even when they go to a leadership meeting. I had a very poignant discussion with a Black gay man who said that just as a person of color, he feels that he stands out and that he's instinctually aware of this. And he said, when he enters into a room, he said, I need to know my exit. Now think about that. I need to know my exit. And as I talked with him about it, he said that he was following an instinct of self-preservation, and that he wanted to be able to know that if things got too hard or if something unexpected happened, he would know how to get out of the room quickly. He also talked about whenever he was expected to share or speak publicly, that he felt very intimidated. That he talked about the need to build up my armor for interpersonal meetings and gatherings because he was feeling the pressure of performance, and he didn't want to be that person of color, the person who falls into that category, and do something that was embarrassing or didn't look right or was awkward. And so feeling the weight of being a distinct minority also added to the weight of how he performed his responsibilities in the ministry of the church. And I came away from those conversations really feeling the heaviness of what they experienced, even as they were fully committed to their churches and were held in high esteem and operated at the highest levels of decision-making in their churches. The other thing is that people who we spoke to who were African American, they also wondered if this new emphasis on racism and addressing whiteness, if it was their project. Now, to think about Black participants and their place in the project of addressing whiteness is pretty important to our project together, because we are starting to figure out where does everybody fit in trying to fulfill this particular aspect of pursuing a better church for tomorrow. Racism, of course, is readily recognized by every African American we spoke to. And they would readily talk about personal stories, things that they had experienced in the world, even in that very week, sometimes in that same day. And they also talked about the experiences that they'd had of racism in their own churches. And in doing so, they were not wondering whether it mattered to address whiteness. It's just that in the midst of it all, they wondered whether whiteness is their own project, because the work seems to involve an effort of acknowledging and recognizing whiteness, which they already do. Of course, there are people who also feel that already having to think and dwell on these things is a constant daily burden. To bring that into the church and to constantly have to work through that only adds to the stress and sometimes reliving aspects of trauma, so that it makes that work that much more difficult in their participation in the church. One Black pastor said, "It's not our problem to fix," and added that they were also experienced just being fatigued, that there are some people who they said won't get it. And she also said that ministers of color still carry scars of trauma, and that in being around other people, that they have to be careful not to let their guard down. Another Black woman, a deacon, said, "I'm not the person who needs this," talking about the anti-racist efforts and projects, and said, "I just need to get through this frickin' day." Mark's going to pick up the next two themes. Mark?
Thanks, Gerardo. I do want to echo what's been said so far, just how grateful we are for your participation. It's no small thing to take some time, an hour and a half, to speak with us about really sensitive issues. And so we're really grateful. I also want to note that we did interview 2 Canadian churches as well. And so so it's an international study in some ways. And so we're pretty proud of that. Another theme around identity is the pride that a lot of our interviewees took in being Baptists, but quote unquote, not those kinds of Baptists. That identity as being a Baptist, but not SBC, was quite central to a lot of the congregations with whom we spoke. And so that distance from the SBC was important, because we also heard terms like open, welcoming, as Gerardo said earlier, progressive and inclusive. And so there's a lot of pride in the congregations we spoke with being welcoming and affirming. And in one of the interviewees that I spoke with even chuckled with delight, remarking that their congregation was known as Brokeback Baptist. And I think they might actually be on the line here today. Many interviewees referenced the prominent display of rainbow flags, either inside or outside the church edifice. And what was really interesting is some folks even thought that the rainbow flag and the discussions about whether we should have that up or not, what that meant, and all the processes and discussions for becoming welcoming and affirming actually provided a bit of a template or a blueprint for tackling some of the other issues like anti-racism. But here's an interesting tension we also saw emerging in the interviews. There was some thought that there could be an incompatibility with being LGBTQ plus affirming, being inclusive, and how those mapped onto anti-racism efforts. And so what we mean by that is some of the folks we spoke with remarked that they wondered, and I should say, whether racial differences have proven harder to overcome than the LGBTQ plus discussions and processes. That was actually a lower hurdle to navigate than becoming anti-racist. I think an interesting thread that we heard in a number of different disparate places where there were instances where potential partnerships between alliance congregations and Black churches literally on the same block or in the same city or the same neighborhood were undermined or undone because of incompatibilities with the way the congregations interpreted issues of being welcoming and affirming. In other words, some of the Black churches did not agree with the position of the Alliance churches. We also heard that some racial structures were baked into the churches. And in that way, the discreteness, the invisibility, the taken for grantedness of white ways of doing things made that harder to overcome than LGBTQ plus issues. And some interviewees even wondered and remarked, perhaps the hyper focus on LGBTQ plus issues, does it come at the expense of other issues? Have we had such a singular focus that it hasn't opened us up to other possibilities? Another theme that we saw was the pride that a lot of interviewees took in how their congregation worshiped. But there's also concerns that there's an exclusionary potential that resided in the worship practices. When we asked questions about identity, it was remarkable how often the interviewees mentioned that their congregation in terms of their historic, traditional, liturgical worship practices. And that was a central point of who they were and who they are. And then some interviewees would also pivot and wondered aloud to us whether that commitment to traditional worship was actually white centering. In other words, the inability to compromise on worship, and this is something we heard from some African American interviewees, they actually expressed to us how they felt as though they were being dismissed, that they were the ones who were having to give something up. They were the ones who were having to compromise if they wanted to enter into worship at an Alliance congregation. And so some folks actually described the worship as Eurocentric, is a term that we heard used. Another person stated to us, the culture of worship hinders diversity. And of course, we followed up sometimes with a question about, well, do you think more diverse worship would be a way to get towards anti-racism or racial justice? And we have to say a lot of the interviewees registered that they had some concerns about diversity in worship and how much it could actually move them toward anti-racism or racial justice. In fact, there were concerns like, if we do make these efforts become more integrated in our worship, will this just devolve into tokenism? And especially, will we be using African-American worship styles or leaders to simply check a box? We also heard, related to this, frequent indications that perhaps homogeneous congregations were not necessarily a bad thing. That the idea of familiarity, comfort, and safety actually functioned to allow for places to really work out theology. And so those are our 5 themes that emerged from our long conversations with you folks. I think Gerardo might wrap this up a little bit, and then we'll transition into a conversation with you about some of our findings.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Kevin and also to Mark. And again, thank you to all of you. Just a couple of quick notes on the interviews. Our interviews, I think we haven't done the precise calculation, but our interviews were about an hour long on average, some a little shorter, but some were definitely longer. And we interviewed, I don't have the exact number, but I think it's 125 people total that we interviewed. So it's quite a few people, as well as a lot of information. So if you happen to hear something that you remember you said, you can be confident that if we put it in the themes, it was something that was shared by many people and was indeed a pattern that we found in people's responses. Those are the highlights. What we want to do is we want to encourage you, what questions, perhaps even comments would you have, and you're welcome to place them in the chat. But we're at a point where we are almost completed with any other interviews that we'll be doing for this phase of the project. And what we're doing from here is trying to learn this better, understand even more, and then be able to use our processes together to consider what does that mean for our congregations. And so we will be having other times to connect with each other, most explicitly our annual gathering of the Thrive cohort churches. And then we will begin thinking through what should be happening in the coming year for Thrive leaders and what would happen in their congregations as well. Paula, is there anything that you feel that we should cover, anything that we may have missed?
Well, I just want to piggyback on what you just said about having completed interviews at this stage, because at the last email I sent out to the cohort, I shared with them the interests that you all have in identifying Black or Latinx or Asian Pacific Islander folks who are lay leaders. I put lay leaders and or ordained leaders in the church, just to learn about more about their experiences of being in predominantly white churches. And several people sent names to me with contact information, but I believe there's probably more that could come in if you might just say what you hope could happen with that.
Thank you. And I'm glad to clarify here. In terms of saying we're completing interviews, we mean for this very first initial phase of making sure that we get as much of an immersed background in what's happening in each of our Thrive congregations. One of the things that has come through out of that process is we believe that we need to hear particular voices and hear particular experiences more so. Especially, we think we need to pay more attention to voices of color. And so as you're expressing, Paula, and I thank you so much for bringing this up, is we believe that we need to hear more distinctly and more clearly, and to be able to follow up on other kinds of things about the role of people of color in their churches in relation to the work of racial justice, regardless of the level of leadership that they have. And so if you are on the ministerial staff in some way, if you are a staff person, not necessarily ordained, if you are a lay leader or have ever served in lay leadership, or if you are a person who has just been around, a longtime member, or even someone who's relatively new to the congregation, we believe that those voices will be valuable in carrying forward the kinds of things that we think we need to hear in order to be able to make sure that that is heard more broadly across the Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
Mark and Kevin, is there anything you want to add to that in particular? Great, thank you. Yes, thank you.
I've asked people to send me those names with contact information, and so keep sending them.
Thank you. Kevin, let me circle back to you. You've done a great presentation. We've talked about some things. Is there anything that you wanted to add as you've thought a little bit more about what you think the Thrive leaders who are with us today would be interested in knowing out of our conversations or out of data that we have not had a chance to present so far?
Yes, well, I do want to say that, we're presenting to you, the thumbnail sketch of what we've done so far. And so there are, the amount of survey questions, you might remember, for the average person, it took 40 minutes to complete that survey. And I spent 6 minutes just summarizing the findings. So we have lots more data to share. There's things that I could say that we're going to do, but I'm most interested to hear from you. Maybe to start, what surprised you? What did you find against your expectations, and then eager to hear what other questions you might have for us.
Okay, so if you guys will look in the chat, Tara and Mark both have written in comments and questions. So
yeah, thank you. I love Kevin's question, and I also appreciate Tara's builds on that in a different way. The question that Tara asks is about from these results, are they as expected? Do we have any surprises? Is this the baseline that you expected? Can I ask Mark to start with that, and then Kevin and I can chime in?
Sure, grateful. Yeah, I would say one of one of the most heartening surprises was all the work that was already going on in these churches. That there was churches having conversations about reparations. There's other efforts towards anti-racism. That there was so much going on already, and it was so fervent so that. But what kind of surprised me a bit is in some instances the recency of it. That it had only been a couple of years. But that a lot of the folks that I interviewed and there are people they were associated with were somewhat new to this idea. They were reading books that they had never heard of before, and so I thought of the Alliance as a very progressive church. But it seems like there's a significant shift that we're catching. A shift in views on racial justice and anti-racism that we're catching it at just the right moment. And so I thought the amount that was going on was remarkable, and how new it was a bit of a surprise for me.
Yeah, I think in my interviews, often what was mentioned was the killing of George Floyd as sort of this incredible motivator. You guys found the same thing? Yeah. So I think that that's important. So it's like the Black Lives Movement itself is not new, but really embracing and working towards that became more of a push in very recent times. And again, George Floyd seemed to be a strong motivator for that. The other surprise that I would mention that we have talked about is that I did not expect to hear about this tension between LGBT plus inclusion and all of the effort and work that it's done there, and the work of anti-racism. There just seems to be a different level of optimism about whether it can be addressed fully or not, about the ways in which maybe LGBTQ plus means that if you're white and gay, that's not a problem. As much as Black and gay, you're needing to select some aspect of your identity. And so if you are Black and gay, then in a sense, you are emphasizing more your sexuality in being a part of the congregation than your racial background. And because so many times when we talk to a person who was African American, they had left their Black churches because of issues related to their stance on sexuality. And so one person very strongly said, I am in exile. I live in exile and I'm longing to go back home. But it didn't come with the hope of ever going back home, meaning that African American or Black church background. And of course, that was super collided with other stray comments, like churches. There was one church who had introduced some gospel music, but there was some really strong pushback from congregants who said, we don't want to become a Black church. So what a leap to go from introducing gospel music or something that was recognizably Black, if you will, in the liturgy, and then to somehow think that translates into a fear that the church was going to transform into a Black congregation. That kind of pushback is not something that I expected, and yet it is very real. And so there are very real situations in which church leaders know that there is talk, there is organization. Sometimes there are people who are working against these issues of addressing whiteness, and that has consequences for the work of the ministry, as well as even how the leaders who care most about racial justice are feeling about it all. There's another question from Mark about the different regions, and I'm wondering if you all think, Mark and Kevin, if you think that there may be regional issues. Is there any difference between North, South? Did Canada matter in these things? And so it says, do you have any awareness if we also track with these concerns, themes, and Christian fellowships not in the Alliance? Any initial thoughts there? Kevin, what's your first thought there?
Well, let me say that the survey is limited to U.S. congregations because it dealt specifically with historic issues in the United States and current race relations in the U.S. So although we do have the two Canadian churches that were participating as Thrive congregations, and in our interviews, we don't have any information from our Canadian members in our survey. But yeah, we have we can do regional analyses. I haven't done them yet, but we can certainly explore, are there differences by region in the Alliance on any range of issues? So that I will make a note of that, and I would say stay tuned to see the findings that emerge.
Okay. Anything on a gut level? I'm wondering, Mark, do you have any sense of this at all?
Well, if I'm reading Mark's question right, he also has a part here that if do you have any awareness with if we also track with concerns, themes, and Christian fellows? Yes. So the one thing I thought about, I use these terms when I was discussing my themes, is nobody used this language of white institutional rules or managed diversity. Are two sociological concepts that are usually applied to white evangelical congregations that are trying to become more racially diverse. And then the kind of the concept is all the sacrifices borne by the people of color who are coming into the congregation. These churches tend to think they do everything race neutral. But then if you're an African-American or Latinx person, you can see the rules. The rules are pretty vivid to you, whereas people who have been there for a long time think, oh, it's just all race neutral. And so I do think like the language wasn't used, but I do think that is something that you did hear some of that in some of our, especially in our interviews. Yeah,
I think that the question is very important from the standpoint of is the kind of differences that we're seeing, the racial sort of difficulties or tensions that we sense in the Alliance, how similar is that to other mainline congregations? I think based on the limited work that's out there currently, I think that we would say that it is fully consistent in the sense that the clear difference of the Alliance is that the Alliance is among the few that have made an outright statement that they will address these issues, that they have made it an institutional imperative. Most others have not made it an institutional imperative. The second thing is that we would see that even though it is an institutional imperative, you're still dealing with congregations in which there is a mix of people who have various levels of attitudes and approach to racial issues on a personal level, on societal level, and those are more difficult to get to. But nevertheless, we did observe that those differences and those difficulties are there. So there is not a uniformly racially progressive church. That is not likely overall. It is still the sense that racism is so embedded in historic structures that we're going to see that even in the most socially progressive congregations and theologically progressive congregations. And I think that may actually be one of the more it's one of the stories of American Christianity today, because we can find readily, just through news or other things, networks that you may have, other mainline congregations who are similarly dealing with racial tensions, even though they have declared themselves to be progressive. So not unusual. What we have an opportunity to do is to try to listen more closely and to then see what happens when we seek to address it directly. Of course, we remain open to being able to look at other congregations and try to track that as best we can. The reason, of course, that we bring up worship is because it's something that emerged out of our work together. That is something that people are thinking about and talking about. Let's move on. So Edith wrote, I don't think I'm skipping anything here. Edith wrote, I was surprised that some members said that they had to be on guard and know where an escape route was when they go to their church. Was this only from Blacks or from all people of color? I'll speak for myself, and Kevin and Mark can chime in. The only people of color I spoke with in my interviews were African American. So that's the limit that I have. Out of that, I got the impression that that is the majority of people of color in Alliance congregations. Kevin and Mark, anything you'd like to add on that?
That was true for me as well. I did have other people of color, but the overwhelming, I mean, it's a small number to begin with, and the majority were Black. And so I think at this point, Edith, great question. It's just too early for us to tell. And that's part of the reason why we want to interview people of color specifically next year, in order to find out what are the perspectives of people of color in Alliance, and to get more information about that.
Thank you, Kevin. Mark, you were starting to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I did interview other people of color beyond African Americans, and I would say that they did not voice this as acutely as some of the African American interviewees that we spoke with.
Thank you. The next from Peace Church, I'd like to hear more about responses from people of color about the need to sacrifice aspects of their culture or identity in Alliance churches. Marks, do you want to start on that? What is it that they need to give up, aspects of their culture or identity in Alliance to be able to be a participant or a member in an Alliance church?
Well, I can tell you, the one thing I was struck by, a number of African American interviewees were long time committed members, but deeply frustrated members, which I think bears watching. I can tell you anecdotally that one interviewee told me he had to walk around, he had to go for a long walk after our conversation, and he sent me a long email that after 30 years, he had things roiling and percolating in him, because so not only did he feel like he had to give some things up theologically, but he also felt largely dismissed and not given opportunities for leadership. So I think that's an important aspect of this as well.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I had the same. I talked to a Black church member in the South, a long-term member of her Alliance church, committed to her church. But she had said, no one has really asked ever to hear my story. And yet she's tapped to do, lead committees and be a voice for promoting diversity. But in terms of letting this individual share their own story, that hasn't been something that's been part of the experience so far. Also, we have some, interesting, the survey gives us some insights into this as well, in terms of what people feel like they have to give up. I mentioned that these three characteristics: worship music, forming friendships, and theology. So here's the interesting thing: less than 1 in 10 whites say that they give up anything to be in member of Alliance. A quarter of the persons of color on our survey said that worship music is a part of giving up their cultural identity, as compared to 7% of whites. And then in terms of who's advantaged in their church, so 2/3 say that whites experience social advantages in their church. A quarter say, and in fact, the group that was seen as having the most disadvantage are Blacks. A quarter say that Blacks are disadvantaged. 22% of Alliance members say that Hispanics are disadvantaged in their church. So there is this perception that the Black experience in these Alliance churches is different, and that's seen in our Black interviewees, and it's also seen for others in our survey responses.
Thank you, Mark and Kevin. Thanks very much. I didn't mean to skip over Doug's comment, by the way. Doug, we're very happy to consider trying to look at other congregations. Our focus is on the Alliance, and we're trying to measure out our energy and how much we have available in terms of time to be able to do things. And at the same time, we are trying to understand things. And so happy to have a further conversation with you, Doug. I know that you care about these issues a lot, and I know that, of course, you have your own research to contribute in this way. And in terms of, again, this idea of worship, we're trying to, of course, just attempt to understand how these things operate, and is it a reflection of broader systemic racism, or how to kind of think about those things. So we're very open to ideas about how best to work through that. Thank you so much. I very much hope to visit you all in Macon, Georgia at some point in the next year or two. In terms of Emmanuel Baptist, a comment more than a question. I appreciate the point that the majority of engagement with racism are individualistic, even while the majority understand racism as a systemic issue. I think that part of the issue for some of us is that systems seem big and hard to confront, hard to change. My hope is that by working together, we gain more power for systemic change. Thank you so much. I feel that that reflects very much the conversations that I had with people. It was easier to kind of think about what I can do as you just kind of wrestle with what do I do. The bigger the thing, the more coordinated, the more it required, organization and people working together, the harder it was to specify what that would be and how that would best work. Certainly some congregations have done different kinds of work, whether it's different kinds of petitioning, standing in front and participating in different kinds of protests, working together to align themselves with other organizations and doing different things, financially giving for different kinds of investments, even things that bordered on reparations. Work was done in at least one church that I think of. So there's certainly work that's done, and certainly we can think better about how we can go on from there.
I'd like to add something on that, Gerardo. So here's one of the interesting findings for me is that a number of you and a number of Alliance members weren't raised in a progressive tradition. You came out of the Southern Baptist Convention, many of my respondents. And so here's the interesting thing for me is that in terms of the solutions to racial justice, some of you still sound like evangelicals, even though in contrast to evangelicals, you see structural and systemic racism, whereas many conservatives today are battling school boards over critical race theory. So it's this interesting understanding that there are structural issues, but then knowing what to do about it is sort of the de facto falling to, well, maybe it is about me having a Black friend. But the solution, I think, and part of what I'm so excited about this project is that many people, are in that same boat. What do I do? This is where your churches are so important. Your churches are the on-ramp to that type of structural activity, political engagement, community involvement that by themselves, your individual members may not know how to take action on. Alliance churches can be the bridge that takes people to those types of structural, systematic efforts that change issues in society.
That's so well said, Kevin. I think part of it, of course, is that for many people who talked about trying to get a handle on racial issues, they're picking up the most convenient thing they know of, which is a book or something like that. And most of those things really try to deal with your own person. You're trying to learn more. You're trying to get up to speed on history. You're trying to understand things like the history of redlining or other issues like that. But to deal with something that's much larger, I think part of it is that we have to appreciate that all of us are living in these different contexts, different states, even our neighborhoods can have wildly different circumstances, which is why we never started this project from the standpoint of creating a standard curriculum that every church would adopt. We are encouraging the notion that we understand ourselves better, hold up the mirror to ourselves, and then from that, be able to take advantage of the context that we are in. And that includes the history of our churches, the people who have participated, the kind of skills and education and connections and other involvements that people have, the energy that people have. And to take that to say, okay, what is it that our church should be doing? What makes sense for our people? What is it, the creative response to the value that we have committed to? And we don't have a precise answer to that. We think that the answer is to stimulate this kind of creativity once we get past the notion, does racism exist or not? Okay, well, that's not a question for you all. So I'm so glad, yes, racism is real and it exists, and that there may be differing experiences among people in the congregations. Well, we're trying to come to terms with that. So now that we can come to terms with some of these things, what do we need to do more than just having a racial justice committee, more than some other things that may seem obvious, like putting up a Black Lives Matter sign, which many of you have done? What is it that would move in the liturgy of the service? What has to do with the physical spacing of your church grounds? What has to do with the kinds of activities that you have that are social activities? What are we doing in terms of who feels welcome and how they feel welcome? I mean, I can multiply these questions all day long, but we need to now enter into a more deliberative brainstorming, thinking through, consideration, creative problem solving, where we are learning from each other. And so moving into the Thrive, becoming not so much the source of survey and interview data, which has never really been the goal. It's to be able to have enough of a self-understanding so that we can reflect responsibly and then see what does that move us to moving from here. So
that's a marvelous segue that we're having another meeting. And these things are exactly what are going to be talked about at that meeting. As a matter of fact, I had a question come to me today after I sent out the reminder of tonight's meeting that I thought already have saved it for us to start looking at for our meeting that's set for June the 4th. So the annual cohort meeting is Saturday, June the 4th, beginning at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time by then. And we'll look forward to discuss exactly what you all are talking about and those creative things. And actually what you're talking about reminds me of the meditation that I offered at the very beginning when it says, instead of just talking and focusing on our dream, focus on the first action that can bring that dream a little closer. And you just named so many potential actions that might help bring this dream of an anti-racist church even closer. So I remind folks about June 4th. And I also want to remind people that the Alliance's annual gathering is happening near the end of April. And I hope you'll go to the website or respond in your email and sign up to participate in that. It's virtual, but our time is up. And is there something else that you all want to say before we close out tonight? Gerardo, did I cut you short on something?
No, thank you so much, Paula. I just wanted to reinforce the reason why we are doing the meeting virtually is because we had such great participation from everyone last year that we want to make sure that everyone is included, and virtual seems the best way to go right now. So we want you to put it on the calendar. We welcome you, and we look forward to a time of interaction, which so many of you said you appreciated from our first meeting together. We really hope to accentuate that in this next time together. Kevin, do you want to add anything more?
What I'm thinking about doing is sending out maybe a survey to them, or at least a Google form where they can send in their questions they want us to talk about on June 4th.
That's great. We can do that. I wanted to also give Kevin and Mark a chance to say anything they wanted to add. Kevin?
Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you. It's an honor to be a part of this project. I view this as life-changing, society-changing work, and I hope that what we learn together becomes a blueprint for other faith communities in the United States to do the same.
Thank you, Kevin. Mark?
Yeah, echoing Kevin, just really grateful for this time this evening, the good questions, and it was a lot of hard work this fall, but always good work and good conversations. And I did not look forward to all 46 that I did, but I am so much better for having been exposed to your thoughts and concerns and passions. And so as a sociologist who studies the intersection of race and religion, it can be quite a demoralizing subject in 2022. I always tell you, it was not a demoralizing fall. It was an invigorating fall, and we're looking forward to the next number of years.
Thank you, Mark. Paula, thank you. I want to make sure that everyone knows Paula has been invaluable to our work, and we're really grateful for the partnership. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be together, and I'm cheering all of our churches on as they all chart their own paths and discern next steps to help make this reality of a just and equitable church indeed part of their church and part of the church universal. So until we meet again, June 4th, peace and blessings. Blessed Lent and Easter before we're all together again. But hope you have a good evening, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.